Hello and welcome to episode 141 of Sabbath Worship with Ben. Hope you all enjoy it, and as usual we'll have a lesson and a presentation. You all will have a blessed Sabbath. This week's memory verse is, I will heal them of their backsliding. I will love them freely, for my anger is turned away from them. Hosea 14 verse 4. The title of the lesson is Come Back. So, Hosea was a prophet in the time of Israel and Judah, and is given the task as many of the prophets back then to turn Israel away from their backsliding. God, however, decided to take a different approach than the usual messages he gave to the prophets. He told Hosea to marry a prostitute as a wife, and back then marrying a prostitute was one of the lowest people that you could marry. So it didn't seem like it would be a great thing for Hosea, but God instructed him to go and marry her and to have children with her. So Hosea obeyed the Lord and married a prostitute. Well, her name was Gomer, and they had children together. But soon Gomer became unhappy and wanted to go back to her prostitute ways, so she ran away, leaving Hosea and children there, and went back to her old way of life. And God, this would happen, and Homer got herself captured and ended up to being forced to be a prostitute, like a slave for a man. So God instructed Hosea to go and buy back Gomer from the man, and he took the equivalent of 30 shekels of silver, which was the price of a slave, just to buy back this prostitute wife. We believe that she stayed with him after that, but that wasn't the point of God's message. It was that he wanted to show the people through Hosea what it was like. So after all of this happened, God told Hosea to instruct the people like he had seen with his wife. Israel was like a prostitute who had once been faithful to God, but seeing how the other nations around them lived, they decided that they wanted to be that way too, and so they started to follow other gods. So this got them into trouble, and they ended up under the servitude of other nations, and because of their sin. So God told them that if they renewed their covenant, that God would gladly have them back, but if they continued, then they would be subject to the nations until the time when they were all captured. So God's message through Hosea was a little different, but it was similar in the sense of the message, but God used a different way to get it across. He wanted the people to see how painful it was when Hosea's wife had ran away, and it wasn't like he was forced to marry her. It says that he enjoyed having her as his wife, the Bible says, but she still wanted to run away. So God used this as an example, using the prophet Hosea to show that people that it hurt them when they, his special people, had abandoned him and gone to follow other gods. So he asked them once again in this message to come back, and he warned them of the consequences of what would happen if they didn't. I'm going to do my lesson. This lesson is going to be about evolution and how to prove it wrong. To prove evolutionists count on two major factors: mutations, which are random changes in things genetic code, which makes up what it is, and natural selection, which selects the good ones and makes them stay while the bad ones are tossed out, kind of like a sieve. So we're gonna just look at the mutation part and assume that the natural selection is working. And so, looking at mutations, there are two types, the good ones and the bad ones. And a random change is almost always bad. You'd think it might be a 50-50 chance, but since most of the things that mutate, like the environment, radiation, or the sun, are often damaging the genetic material to change it, it's reasonable to expect that mutations are almost always negative. This presents a big problem immediately, because to make the changes, to make the good changes, you have to have a series of good mutations without any bad mutations happening. Or if you have any bad mutations, you have to have a good mutation just to cover up what you lost. So looking at this, you have to think carefully about how these mutations would happen. To start off with our simulation, let's start off by examining a simple organism. Now, some slightly advanced bacteria might have about 200 working parts that all work together inside of the cell. Now, ignoring how natural selection works, or how life started, or the universe is created, or all that. Just looking at the mutations part, let's assume, even though it's much less, that the mutation chance has a 1/2 chance of being good or bad. So this makes a simple probability, which is that if you take two probabilities and as fractions and multiply them, it gets your new probability. So since there's a 50% chance, that translates to a 1/2 chance. That stands for 1 out of 2. The 1 over the line and is how many you got right. And the 2 is how many there were in total. So it's the same as flipping a coin. Say you want to flip a coin and you want to get heads twice. So heads, you can say, represents the good mutation. Instead of there being a 1/2 chance, now there are 2 chances. So each time you could get heads or you could get tails. But now there are 4 possibilities instead of the 2 heads or tails. There's now heads, tails, tails, heads, or tails, tails. So these 4 possibilities now make it much less likely, from 1/2 to 1/4 of a chance, or 25%. So you can find that by multiplying 1/2 by 1/2 equals 1/4. So what this math lesson means is that basically you can find out whatever probability by simply taking the chance of 1 and taking it to the exponent of how many times you did it. Since 1/2 times 1/2 is really the same as 1/2 to the power of 2, it's the same, gives you the same answer. So however many times we do this, however many times we run the simulation, is what we want to know. And we also want to know answer. So if we take our probability of a good mutation, which is assumed at 1/2, and we multiply it by the amount of times we want to do it, which is 200, we'll find the chance of how likely it is for us to do that. since we're doing this would be basically the probability of you flipping a coin 200 times in a row, and you wanted to get heads every time in a row. And we can't factor in and if we factor in anything else, it just gets worse, because then we'd have to get the same out of 201, but we just have a negative mutation. So any negative mutations just increase the number of positive mutations we have to have, and the overall amount of times we have to do it. So if we assume that we want to do it right on the first try, this is the best possibility we're going to get. So seeing this, we talked about the exponents, which is really just saying you'll multiply a number by itself however many times is in the smaller upper right hand corner number. That's 1/2 to the power of 200, and since it's not multiplying 1/2 by 200, but it's really multiplying 1/2 by 1/2 200 times, we end up with a very small fraction. Since we talked about the probability can be represented as a fraction, with the 1 being how many times you got it right, and with the top number being how many times you did it right, and the bottom number being how many times you had to try to do it right, we end up with a fraction of 1/10 to the power of 60, or rather 1 chance in 10 to the power of 60. And so 10 to the power of 60 is very large. In fact, our possibility of this happening ends up to be 1 chance in a trillion. So just to put that in perspective, imagine you have 1 trillion balls, and so you put all those trillion balls into one bigger ball. And now you take that bigger ball and you make 1 trillion of those, all with the trillion ball inside of each of the trillion balls. And then you put those trillion balls of the trillion balls inside of each ball into a bigger ball. And so you do that 5 times. And then you count all the balls. And then you count all the balls. And that would be how big of a number 10 to the power of 60 is. So evolutionists know that that could never happen. In fact, you have to prove something will happen 1 out of every single time for 10 to the power of 50 times for it to be a scientific law like gravity. You have to be able to say that at least every 10 to the power of 50 times gravity will work, and maybe the 10 to the 50th power time plus 1, it won't work. So seeing as this number is 1 in 10 to the power of 60, that couldn't possibly work. So they say that with all of the square space on Earth, for all the time that Earth has existed, it's been evolving. So to look at these assumptions, we're going to have to figure out how many tries could have taken place over all that time. So we'll assume that an organism can mutate at one mutation every second, while it really takes much longer. And so we'll assume that for a billion, which is 10 to the power of 8 organisms, they can all mutate once a second, and so a billion can fit on 1 square foot. And so Earth has about 10 to the power of 14 square feet. So we'll add that in the mix, and then scientists claim Earth has been around for 10 billion years, which gives the organisms about the power of 18 seconds to evolve. That just shows how big numbers are. A billion all the way to about 10 billion is only a change of 10 in the exponent value. So we have our numbers. It takes 1 second permutation, so we'll add 1 to the mix. And then we multiply that by 10 to the power of 8, the amount of time the organisms had, times 10 to the power of 14, the amount of space for organisms to test on. And then 10 to the power of 18, which is how much time they've had to test for, even though in reality the organisms couldn't have been alive when Earth was still a molten core, but we'll even throw in that. And so the final result that we get in a number is that, well, the amount of tries that could have possibly started, no more than this, since the beginning of Earth. For this, all these 1-part organisms, 0-part organisms trying to get to 200 parts, is about 10 to the power of 40. So that's how many tries could have happened. So now that we have that, it's very simple. We just take the possibility of one organism doing it and divide it by the amount of tries. So if we take 10 to the power of 60 and divide it by 10 to the power of 40, we'll find that we're left with a chance of any of the organisms ever getting to the full 200 parts is about 10 to the power of 19. While that might seem much better, that's 10 to the power of 19 is still more than a quintillion, which is 1,000 quadrillions, and 1 quadrillion is 1,000 trillions. So looking at that, we can see that the chance of any of these organisms ever growing all the way up to the 200-part organism is impossible. Then, just to top it all off, we can look at the simplest plant and animal cells. They can have millions of interlocking proteins and parts that work together inside the cell. So, seems clear to me that numbers leave evolution with no logical standpoint to go on. So, Celeste's presentation for this week. Hope you enjoyed it, and you all will have a blessed Sabbath. See you next time. Till then, bye.